Today's video is part 3 of a 3-part series about the mark of the beast, and in this video I'll talk about what the mark will be according to the Bible. To quickly recap the first 2 parts, in part 1 I talked about how Trump is very publicly embracing the number 45 as the actual number of his name, and as a result Trump is now perfectly matching Revelation 13:17 in that he marks his property just like the Antichrist will, with either a simple mark, his own name, or the number of his name. In part 2, I talked about how the number 666 in Revelation 13:18 is pointing us directly to King Solomon, and more specifically to King Solomon's gold, and that the Bible is telling us that the final Antichrist will be obsessed with gold and with the sun god. Coincidentally, Trump is also obsessed with gold and the sun god. Now let's move on to part 3. First, I want to say up front that some of you watching this video will not agree with what I'm going to say, and that is because I'm going to base this video on what the Bible actually tells us about the mark and not on wild speculation or conjecture based on the latest news headline. I realize, however, that just because something is being wildly speculated about, that doesn't automatically rule it out. Now let's move on to talking about what the mark will be according to the Bible. In order for us to recognize the mark when it appears, we need to ask 5 very important questions. You might recognize these 5 questions as what's famously referred to as the 5 W's, which help us ascertain the specific facts on a given topic. Those 5 W's stand for who, what, when, where, and why. By getting the biblical answers to these 5 questions, we will then be able to understand the requirements or general parameters for something to actually be the mark. So here are the 5 questions. Who institutes the mark? What will the mark look like? When does the mark appear? Where will the mark be? Why is there going to be a mark? The answer to these 5 questions must be based on what the Bible teaches us, not on our own speculation. These answers will give us the framework or template that the mark of the beast must fall into. If someone claims that a certain thing is the mark, but it doesn't fit inside of this framework, then it is not the mark. Let's begin. Question number 1. Who institutes the mark? The answer to this first question is easy to find, and yet it's astonishing how many Christians get this wrong, or don't bother to see what the Bible actually says, and instead assume that what they've always heard is accurate. There are many people who believe that it's the Antichrist who will institute the mark of the beast, but this is simply not what the Bible says. On the contrary, according to the Bible, it is the false prophet who introduces the mark of the beast. In Revelation 13, we see 2 different beasts described. One is the Antichrist and one is the false prophet. We know that these are 2 separate living individuals because Revelation 19:20 tells us that each of these figures are to be cast alive into the lake of fire. Only things that are actually living can be thrown alive into the lake of fire. The Antichrist is introduced to us beginning in verse 1 of Revelation 13 and described as a beast rising out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns. In a few weeks I'll do a video covering what these 7 heads and 10 horns signify, but for right now, let's concentrate on the false prophet. The second beast, the false prophet, is introduced in verse 11, and as we read in verse 16, it's the false prophet who institutes the mark of the beast. There are, of course, different interpretations of who the false prophet will be. As I've said before in other videos, I am convinced he will be a coming pope, very possibly the next pope, who will work in tandem with the Antichrist. But no matter who you think the false prophet will be, please remember that he will be a living person. Again, non-physical entities such as the Vatican or Rome or a certain church or government simply cannot be thrown alive into the lake of fire as Revelation 19:20 teaches us will happen. Thus, this is the first requirement for something to be the mark of the beast. It has to be introduced by the false prophet, who is a real living person. If it isn't introduced by the false prophet, then it's not the mark. Question number 2. What will the mark look like? According to Revelation 13:17, the mark of the beast will appear as one of 3 things: a unique mark representing the beast, the actual name of the beast, or the number of his name. In order for someone to buy or sell, that person will need to have one of these 3 things. In other words, the only way for anyone to earn a living during the last 3.5 years of the Antichrist rule is by having one of the 3 variations of the mark, which in turn will allow them to participate participate in the beast worldwide economic system. As I said a moment ago, Trump is now matching this verse perfectly in how he marks his own property. He has a unique mark, the letter T, to signify his name. He also uses his actual name on properties, and he is now self-identifying with the number 45 as the number of his name. These three variations of Trump's mark are exactly the same three variations that the Bible tells us will represent the final Antichrist. Yes, it's the false prophet who brings about the mark of the beast, but the mark itself points to the Antichrist. In case you didn't notice, the letter T that Trump uses to mark his properties bears a striking resemblance to the Christian cross, only missing the head of the cross. I don't believe that this is a mere coincidence. The Antichrist is not only against Christ, but he presents himself as an imitation of, and even a replacement for, the true Savior. It should be no surprise to us that the Antichrist will use a symbol that mimics the most famous symbol in Christianity. In a moment, I'll get into whether the mark is physical or merely symbolic. But for now, we have the second requirement for something to be the mark of the beast. It must take the form of a simple mark, or the actual name of the beast, or the number of his name. Question number 3. When does the mark appear? Of the 5 W's I mentioned a few moments ago, the when question might be the most important in helping us get a firmer grasp on what the mark of the beast will consist of. To solve the when question, we need to remember Daniel's prophecy of 70 weeks, which is the key to understanding much of Bible prophecy. This prophecy, in conjunction with other Bible verses, tells us that the Antichrist will rule for 7 years, or what is referred to as the final week of Daniel's prophecy of 70 weeks. A shocking event, however, is prophesied to happen halfway through those 7 years, as the Antichrist breaks his own covenant with many and takes away the daily sacrifice in the third temple. This leads to the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not, and is the beginning of the final 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. This final 3.5 year period is referenced in Revelation 13:5, as the Antichrist is given unto him to continue for 42 months. Sometime after this event happens, the mark of the beast is introduced in verse 16 by the false prophet. We now have the time frame for when the mark of the beast is introduced to the world by the false prophet. It is after the final Antichrist comes to full power during the final 3.5 years of his reign. And that reign begins when the Antichrist enters the third temple and claims to be God or a god. This is the third requirement for something to be the mark of the beast. It must be introduced after the Antichrist enters the third temple, which begins his final 3.5 year reign. Question number 4. Where will the mark be? If there is one thing that nearly all Christians will agree on, it's that the mark of the beast will be on or in one's right hand or forehead. The disagreement tends to be whether this will be an actual physical mark or symbolic or figurative in some way. Indeed, those who state that the mark is symbolic can make an argument. There are several different verses which reference God marking or sealing his people in the forehead, including Revelation 7:3, Revelation 9:4, Revelation 14:1, Revelation 22:4, and elsewhere. These verses are clearly symbolic in nature. Also, going back to Deuteronomy, God told Israel that his laws are to be upon their hearts, and they are to bind them on their hands and foreheads. Although there are Jews who wear phylacteries around their heads, the true meaning of the command was clear to nearly all other Jews, and very few will argue that the verses in Deuteronomy are to be taken literally. Those who believe that there will be a physical mark can also make a case. They will often point to the word used for mark in the original Greek. That word is charagma and does mean a literal scratch or etching or a graven image, almost like a branding. The mark being a physical etching or engraving can also be argued from a foreshadowing perspective. Just as the Antichrist will physically desecrate the third temple, so the mark of the beast will physically desecrate the temple of our bodies. And we also have Revelation 16:2, which says that there will be a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, implying that the mark is indeed physical. To be fair, though, that verse does not say that the mark itself becomes noisome and grievous, only that these men will receive a terrible sore somewhere on their bodies. So which is it? Is the mark symbolic, with the right hand symbolizing our work and the the forehead symbolizing our thoughts, or is it a literal mark, with the original Greek word charagma telling us that this will be a physical etching or engraving on the skin? None of us know 100% what it will be right now, but in a couple of moments I'll explain my thoughts on this issue after we had finished the 5 W's. Thus, the fourth requirement for something to be the mark of the beast is that it must involve the right hand or the forehead in some manner. Whether this is literal or symbolic, we'll discuss in a moment. Question number 5. Why is there a mark of the beast? The latter half of Revelation 13 is when we see the mark of the beast introduced by the false prophet, and by reading verses 12 through 17, we can quickly discern the purpose of the mark. Verse 12 teaches us that the false prophet causes the earth to worship the Antichrist. Verse 13 and 14 explain that the false prophet will perform great wonders in order to deceive humans into making an image to the Antichrist. Verse 15 describes the false prophet as having the power to give life to the image, that those who don't worship it should be killed. And finally, in verses 16 and 17, we see that the false prophet brings about the mark of the beast as a means to force humanity's allegiance to the Antichrist in return for one being able to earn a living in the beast economy. It is clear then that the mark is designed to enforce the loyalty to and worship of the Antichrist. It's all about praising the man of sin, the one with the insatiable ego, and acknowledging him as the most powerful being on earth. Just as the true prophets pointed to Jesus, the false prophet will point to the Antichrist. Thus, the fifth requirement for something to be the mark of the beast is that it is a sign of allegiance and must clearly and unequivocally point to the Antichrist. So we now have, according to the Bible, the 5 requirements or parameters for something to be the mark of the beast. First, it has to be introduced by the false prophet, who is a living person. Second, it will consist of a simple mark, the beast's name or the number of his name. Third, the mark appears during the last 3.5 years of the Antichrist's reign. Fourth, the mark will involve the right hand or forehead in some way. Fifth, the mark is a sign of allegiance and will clearly point to the Antichrist. So, does anything right now fit these 5 requirements? When it comes to the mark of the beast, too many of us tend to jump on the latest bandwagon and convince ourselves that a certain technology or news headline is connected to the mark. And this has been happening for quite a while. We can go back to 1936 when Social Security numbers were first introduced, and many Christians pronounced them as the mark of the beast. Or in recent decades with computers, chip implants, robots, cell phones, holograms, clones, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and many other things. Whatever the latest invention or technology is, you will find at least a few Christians are convinced that it is the mark of the beast. And I've also made the same mistake, as in years past I convinced myself that technologies such as smartwatches, Google Glass, or other wearable smart devices were soon going to be directly linking us to the worldwide economy of the beast. But then, the more I studied the Bible, the more I've learned that there are certain parameters that the mark must fall into in order for it to be the mark. And because of that, I've learned to not jump to conclusions about the latest news headline. We should also remind ourselves that the latest technology can be intrusive into our personal lives, either by government or big business, and yet not necessarily be the actual mark of the beast. Or it can be a step towards the mark, but not be the mark itself. A good way to think of this is to visualize a staircase leading up to a floor we've never been to. We know that something is at the top of the stairs, something called the mark of the beast, but it's just slightly out of focus and we can't quite see what it is. However, we are able to see the individual steps leading up to that mystery floor. Each of those individual steps could be an important component of the mark of the beast, but they are not in and of themselves the mark. Instead, they are a step toward the mark. As time goes on and we get closer and closer to the last 3.5 years, the more the mark of the beast will come into focus. The more we will be able to see what it is, and when it finally comes into view, everyone will know that it's the mark, and there will be no debating what it represents. And that brings up a point I want to make. There will will likely be several different components to the mark of the beast, and we shouldn't have blinders on and think that it will only concern vaccines, or only smart technology, or only involve our banking information. Whatever form the mark of the beast finally takes, it will almost certainly involve every area of our lives, from our ability to earn a living, to our personal health, even to tracking our location. Nothing should be ruled out, but I am convinced that the final version of the mark will be a comprehensive mechanism to enforce allegiance to the Antichrist. If you have ever searched online for images related to the mark of the beast, you undoubtedly saw a myriad of people with a big 666 or a barcode emblazoned on their foreheads, or some sort of chip implant or other obvious mark in their hands. But is that the way this will really go down? Will billions and billions of people all over the world be walking around with such noticeable marks on their forehead or hands? Will the mark of the beast be that easy to identify, and by extension, that easy to refuse? I'm not so sure. I believe that those who refuse the mark will do so not because they will be scared away by an easy to identify mark on the forehead or hand, but because of the actual purpose or meaning behind the mark, which is the worship of the Antichrist. Because in the end, that's the whole intent behind the mark, to brand humanity as the property of the beast, and to force the worship of the Antichrist by making it next to impossible to live without the mark. They will want us to be loyal to the Antichrist and to reject Jesus Christ. That is not to say that I think the mark is purely symbolic. Just like the Antichrist will physically desecrate the third temple, I am convinced that the mark of the beast will, in some way, physically desecrate the temple of our bodies. But will it be visible to others? Not necessarily. Allow me to illustrate one example. You probably saw the recent news reports on how Amazon has started a service to allow customers at Whole Foods to pay for their items by scanning their palms. Anyone with even the slightest interest in the mark of the beast had their ears perk up at that story. Out of curiosity, I searched for information on forehead prints. Sure enough, there is a technology that recognizes the individual prints that each of us have in or on our foreheads, and there are indeed forehead print readers in the works. The point that I'm making is that there are a myriad of ways for our bodies to be marked with the beast, and it might be in ways that are not necessarily visible to the naked eye, and yet they would be every bit of a physical mark on our skin as anything could be. We already have a unique physical mark on our hands and foreheads, just like we do in every other part of our bodies. We shouldn't rule out the possibility that this unique mark could one day be linked to the mark of the beast. So my belief is that this mark will be a physical scratch or etching of some kind, but it may not be visible to the naked eye. Furthermore, that it might piggyback onto the unique marks already on our bodies, such as our palm prints or forehead prints. At the beginning of this video, I talked about how the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why, would help us get the biblical facts surrounding the mark of the beast. Many of you probably know that there's also a 6th question that we can add to this mix, and that question is how. How will the mark be introduced to the world? What are the events that will bring it about? Initially, I was going to add my thoughts on this matter at the end of this video, but the more I considered it, the more I realized that it probably deserves its own video, as it's an interesting topic to discuss. In the meantime, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the mark, either as it relates to this video or what you think the future holds for us. That's all for today. Thank you again for taking the time to watch this video, and if you care to leave a comment, please do. As always, please be respectful in any comment you leave. I'll talk to you guys soon.